Hello, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Sasha Sagan and Emily Levesque for their books For Small Creatures Such as We and The Last Stargazers. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. I know we have some Massachusetts folks blowing up the chat, so if you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if you are one of maybe the Georgia or the Colorado folks, welcome. If this is your first time hearing about us, we're so happy to have you all join our community this evening. We appreciate your support of these authors and their incredible books and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. And now allow me to introduce our wonderful authors that we have here this evening. Emily Levesque is an astronomy professor at the University of Washington, studying how the most massive stars in the universe evolve and die. She has observed with many of the planet's largest telescopes and flown over the Antarctic stratosphere in an experimental aircraft for her research. Her academic accolades include the 2014 Annie Jump Cannon Award and the 2020 Newton Lacey Pierce Prize from the American Astronomical Society. The Last Stargazers is her first popular science book, and I'd love to tell you a bit about it. From the lonely quiet of midnight stargazing to tall tales of wild boars loose in the observatory, The Last Stargazers is a love letter to astronomy and an affirmation of the crucial role that humans can and must play in the future of scientific discovery. In this sweeping work of narrative science, Levesque shows how astronomers in this scrappy and evolving field are going beyond the machines to infuse creativity and passion into the stars and space, and it inspires us all to peer skyward in pursuit of the universe's secrets. And now to introduce Sasha, our other author tonight is Sasha Sagan. She holds a degree in dramatic literature from NYU. She's worked as a television producer, filmmaker, editor, and speaker in New York, Boston, and London, and her writing has appeared in the New York Magazine, Oh, the Oprah Magazine, Literary Hub, Mashable, The Violet Book, and elsewhere. For Small Creatures Such as We is her first book, and I'd love to tell you a bit about that one as well. Sasha Sagan was raised by secular parents, the astronomer Carl Sagan and the writer and producer Andrew Yin. They taught her that the natural world and vast cosmos are full of profound beauty, and that science reveals truths more wondrous than any myth or fable. When Sagan herself became a mother, she began her own hunt for the natural phenomena behind our most treasured occasions, growing these roots into a new set of rituals for her young daughter that honor the joy and significance of each experience without relying on a religious framework. As Sagan shares these rituals, For Small Creatures Such as We becomes a moving tribute to a father, a newborn daughter, a marriage, and the natural world, a celebration of life itself and the power of our families and beliefs to bring us together. It is such a pleasure to have you both here tonight. I can't wait to hear what you two talk about. Everyone, please make some noise in the chat for Emily Levesque and Sasha Sagan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bonnie. That was so nice.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
Yes, we're really excited to be here. We wish that we were in person with all of you, but we will make this feel like we're all in a room together.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, Emily, I just finished a few days ago reading your beautiful book, and I loved it so much. And there were so many. Our books are pretty different, but I think there's like these overlapping themes that, if you don't mind me just aggressively jumping right in.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me so much in the beginning, when you talk about your parents being not scientists by training, but scientists by nature. And it's just like this idea that I sort of wrestle with too, as a non-scientist myself, where it's like when science is your guiding principle, your pathway to understanding, the route you take to separate fact from fiction, but it's not your degree or your occupation, like what is that called, and I'm curious about like what you think about that as a person who is a scientist, all day during the day, and I assume has that as the method by which you sort of see the world.
Yeah, no, and it's a great question to start with. And it's funny because I had actually gotten the same impression reading your book. You used a great analogy at one point where you talked about how everybody who is, say, raised Catholic is able to say, yes, I am Catholic, even though not everybody becomes a priest. And I feel like I sort of I did sort of the science version of that. Neither of my parents are professional scientists, but they're both so science minded. And I happened to go pro, but it was very much the, ethos of our family.
Yeah.
It was, and first of all, I mean, I can't not bring it up that part of the influence behind how my parents got to this point was they both watched and adored the TV series Cosmos. I grew up with your dad's books on our bookshelves.
Yeah.
And that same air of, there's such cool stuff to just be found in the natural world, and you can collect the natural world and knowledge about the natural world, like just cool things that you want to know. That was very much impressed upon me. And I don't ever recall we never had discussions in detail about a belief system in our house. It's very much through sort of actions of exploring the world around us. And there was enthusiasm for everything. To this day, we can all talk about birds for forever, or plants, or the stars. And that sort of value of curiosity and the value of asking questions and then scrutinizing and finding out the answers was just something that always stuck. In academia, there are people whose parents are also professors or who have also been in a similar field to them. And I've had people ask me, are your parents scientists? And my answer is always, well, not professionally, but kind of. And it's very much the sort of thing that, so my husband is an engineer, and it's very much a habit that we now have in our household, that the way to be entertained and the way to enjoy the world is to poke at how it works and learn weird new things. And he'll, send me a link to an article about tardigrades, so water bears that can be quantum entangled. And I'll send him an article about a cool bird that was seen somewhere in the Northeast. And that's very much our way of enjoying the world.
Yeah, no, and that really comes through. And I think that you brought up sort of what can stand up to scrutiny, and this idea. One of my favorite things in the book is you use the phrase ruthless scrutinizing. I think I have it written down in my notes, but this idea that is a value, and not I think sometimes we have this idea that looking really hard at something and being really critical, thinking really critically, it takes the fun out of something, rather than being this amazing system we have in place to understand something more deeply and to see whether or not it stands up to scrutiny. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing to see it as, there's sort of this, I don't know, there's this feeling in the culture sometimes that a mystery is good, not understanding something is positive, and facts are cold and hard. And we have this negative association with that can actually stand up to rigorous questioning. And I think that one of the things that is so what you talk about and what you really explain are the ways in which it's a value. It's something that's glorious to have those really hard questions asked, and the ways in which that's the pathway to deeper understanding and these amazing discoveries that you touch on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I just had a conversation with another author where we were talking about science denial. And it's interesting to talk about that in the context of asking questions, because I think sometimes it can go the route of people ask questions and they see it as a contrarian point of view, that no matter what someone says, you must question it. And I think the difference, and it's a good choice of word, because you want to scrutinize, not necessarily question. You're not asking a question to prove something to yourself in your mind. You're asking your question because you're honestly curious about the answer. And it's an interesting balance to hit in science. And it's a balance I hope we can communicate to people, that scientific research is about coming up with an idea, testing that idea, poking at that idea to see if you can find holes in it. But at some point saying, this stood up pretty well. We're going to go with this until something better comes along.
And that the stuff that doesn't hold up falls away. And I think that one of the things that my parents really instilled in me is this idea that it's an accomplishment if you disprove the status quo as a scientist. That is something to be celebrated, and that's a heroic intellectual feat, versus this like forbidden thing that you've done that's like blasphemous. And I think that really, like, if more people understood that that's the changing our changing understanding is a reflection of how well things are going, rather than this idea that it's like a wishy-washy flip-flopping perspective on our world.
Yeah. I actually had a question for you on that, because your book very broadly covers all of this, and it looks at sort of finding the humanity and beauty and sources of ritual, but in a secular world and in science. And I'm curious about whether it seems from your book that the answer is yes, but I'd love your thoughts on how this kind of approach can help science and the natural world seem more like a way of life and a framework. I think sometimes people see science as that subject that was hard in school and they had a mean teacher this one time and there's too much math, and seeing it instead of that as a way to enjoy the world and even a framework for ritual and community, especially for folks that tend to just associate that with religion.
Totally. And I think that's, part of what we're missing. I mean, the mean school teacher, like, that's real. And it takes, like, if you're lucky, in any subject, you have a couple of really enthusiastic, not jaded teachers in your, and from between kindergarten and day you graduate high school. And, that, like, that's lucky if you have a few in each subject. And I think that when we think about like the grandeur and the majesty of what we've been able to uncover about our species, about our planet, about our universe in just the last 50 or 100 years. And you think about what your great grandparents, if they could have understood a fraction of what we now take for granted as like, of course, I think taking that perspective of this long view of, we get very used to things very quickly. And I mean, DNA is the one that gets me all the time. And like, if we presented to children, to each other, this idea, and I write about this in the book, like, there is a secret code in your blood that connects you to your ancestors, to everyone who ever lived, to the first life on earth, and it can solve mysteries that seemed lost to time. It can reconnect people who were completely separated from who they came from and who they were. And it's real, whether you believe in it or not. Like, if we presented that, as this majestic, beautiful thing, and so much else. I mean, astronomy is full of these unbelievable discoveries that we don't always present in this with the same enthusiasm and the same willingness to simplify it for children or for lay people or for people who it's just not their area of interest. I think that would really make a difference, because there's so much more there than there is in any other philosophy, but we don't present it in the same way. And I think that would be great, not because it would be great for science. I mean, it would maybe get more people interested, but it would be great, I think, for people to have that kind of, right? So much of what people grasp at that's not scientific and lean on is because we want to feel connected to one another. We want to feel connected to our place in the universe. We want to be connected to our planet, and that there is real evidence-based ways of thinking about those connections that can give us that joy and that sense of wholeness, without relying on like the woo-woo of it all. So I feel like for you, what you're doing and making so much of this information accessible to people who might not be astronomers or necessarily, know that much about astronomy, like, that is a really powerful thing. And I think that does a lot to move things in that direction.
It's great to hear you put it like that, in terms of sort of unifying things that can bring people happiness or wonder, because especially when my book first came out, when we were in the midst of COVID-19, people asked me, and I think it was a fair question. I had to ask myself this sort of, why does this book matter right now? So, I mean, The Last Stargazers is the behind the scenes adventures of astronomers and what it's like to be a professional astronomer and how our field's evolving. And I think it's fascinating, but I have to convince readers that it's fascinating in a time when we're reading a lot about virology and hearing about a lot of terrible things happening in the world. And the answer I always gave for why should we still care about astronomy is we've seen what being a planet is like right now. The whole planet is dealing with a virus, or the whole planet is dealing with very common human challenges. And I feel like astronomy gives the whole planet the opportunity to share joy or share triumph when we take the first picture of a black hole. Early in the pandemic, comet Neowise made a close pass by Earth, and I think the entire northern hemisphere could see it. And I was out in Seattle. It was a not cloudy night. I was standing 6 feet away from groups of people. We're all wearing masks, but we all have our phones out taking pictures of the comet. And I remember thinking, everybody's dealing with all these terrible challenges right now, but we're also all taking a moment to go, oh my God, it's a comet. And astronomy, I love astronomy's ability to do that for people.
Yes. And one thing I kept thinking about while I was reading your book is, over the last 2 years, if nothing else, we've realized how interconnected we are and how, something that happens in a very remote place, to us that feels like it's, a million miles away, how much it can impact us. And there's one passage where you write about like a natural disaster in Papua New Guinea, I think, or something happens, and it impacts what you're doing on the other side of the planet. Can you want to share like that piece?
Yeah, this actually happened when I visited a really unusual observatory here in Washington State, which is the Laser Interferometry Gravitational Wave Observatory. And I think it's the most amazing thing we've ever engineered, with the possible exception of the lunar lander. We've built these instruments with arms perpendicular to one another that are over 2.5 miles long, that can detect these tiny squeezes and stretches of space-time that happen when two black holes collide. So you get these amazingly gravitationally violent events, and we pick them up on Earth as these teeny tiny little squeezes of space-time. The only reason these instruments can do that is because they detect any tiny change in their setup. So they're great at detecting gravitational waves, but they can detect trucks driving on a highway nearby. They can detect rain hitting the ground. And when I visited this facility, I visited on a day when it was off, because they explained that my footsteps would have been enough to cause problems. And there had been a large earthquake in Papua New Guinea, I think the day before, and you could still see in the signal of the detector sort of the ringing leftover signal of the gravitational wave and of the earthquake. And they were explaining how they had to keep an eye out for earthquakes happening on the other side of the Earth and sort of treat this huge, delicate observatory accordingly. But it was this sort of fascinating, it really makes you think of Earth as a planet, as opposed to these impossibly distant places we all live.
Yes. And I think that's one of the things that's also so important about astronomy, and just having this perspective of our planet as a tiny planet in a vast ocean, is, this idea that we're all in it together, and that, I think a lot of what I write about is this idea that, that our traditions and rituals seem so different from one another, and the costumes and the script are different, but the real kernel of what we're celebrating and what we're marking are these, cyclical or permanent changes, whether it's the solstices and equinoxes, the changing of the seasons, birth, coming of age, death, these astronomical and biological events that get dressed up very differently. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, land diving in Vanuatu as a rite of passage for young men is so different than a bar mitzvah or a quinceañera or whatever. But it's the same, it's the same idea as the child is becoming an adult, and everyone's like, wow, how did this happen? We have to somehow acknowledge this change that this person is now going to, carry on the next generation of DNA. And I think that, both of these things, even though they're so different, but both sort of relating to the South Pacific and the examples we gave, this idea that it's like down here on the ground, it feels like we're so different from, any other group or any other culture. And when you zoom out, you realize that those walls are artificial. And I think there's something really powerful about that. And the other thing that I kept thinking about that was so relevant to the pandemic when I was reading your book was, I mean, I don't know about you or our audience, Nate, but like I am like in a like travel like lust, like all I think about is like booking a trip somewhere I've never been before. And there you go to so many fascinating places. And I like have to ask you, because I was having all this like travel envy, like, you know, of all these telescopes, both in terms of the telescopes themselves and the opportunity to observe from each of these places, but also in terms of all of these remote places themselves, like what just stands out to you as like, when you think like, even if I never go on another trip as long as I live, at least I've been to X.
So in terms of my favorite observatory, like the observatory that I'm most glad to have been to, it's hard to pick a favorite because they're all so fascinating, but my favorite one, and it's the one that I think I spend the most time at in the book, is Las Campanas Observatory, which is an observatory in Chile. And I visited there more than a handful of times for my research. I went down once specifically to research this book. And I think Chile was the very first country I went to outside the US when I was in college. It was my first overseas trip to an observatory. And just the wildlife down there is fascinating. I don't speak Spanish, and being able to fumble along and how amazingly generous folks are when they realize that I'm going to be a limited participant in conversations is amazing to see. And then the observatory is just stunning. It's in the Andean foothills. It's obviously and purposefully built very far from light pollution. So the night sky that you see there is shocking. And I tell stories in the book of walking and literally navigating by starlight. The moon was down, but the stars were so bright that they almost cast shadows. And looking through a telescope's eyepiece while I was down there, which is something people don't realize that a lot of astronomers don't get to do all that often. Our biggest and best telescopes nowadays, some of them don't even have eyepieces. But I was there with some colleagues on a night when we had some time off, and someone said, you know, we're going to go put an eyepiece on the smallest telescope on the mountain with a mirror that's still a meter across. And we all transformed into 8-year-olds the second our eye was up to the eyepiece. Oh, it's so sparkly. It's so bright. Oh, you can see the colors. Oh, no, point at this, point at that. And you'd think that we would get bored. We'd think that this would be, oh, yeah, we work on these all the time, but it doesn't get any less cool. So this particular observatory is always going to have a special sort of place in my memory because of that.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that was a very memorable scene in the book. And just like, you know, it's amazing because you really draw this sort of amazing paradox between the glamorousness and the unglamorousness of this experience. You know, there are so many, it's like, oh, she's in Hawaii, she's in Chile, you know, she's going all these amazing places. And then it's also like, and, you know, the like just practical, what it takes to actually do the observations. It's so fascinating how much of it is like not that, doesn't feel like that technologically advanced or glamorous, at least in years gone by.
I loved the juxtaposition of how grand the questions are that we're trying to answer, you know, like, are we alone? How's the universe going to end? And then how hilariously pedestrian the problems sometimes are at telescopes. I've had colleagues who've said I had to cancel my observing run because our telescope was swarmed by ladybugs.
I mean,
or because a part broke in an incredibly boring and familiar way. Everybody that's ever had a battery die or a shutter go on a camera, or these just like, or it was too windy. And I, for some reason, really get a kick out of this contrast between the really lofty things that we want to explore and the things we can discover, and then and I interviewed more than 100 of my colleagues for this book, and I just had everybody sort of tell me their favorite observing stories and sort of collected them after the fact into what would make a book. But so many were versions of, they would get so excited telling me about the science, and then they'd say something like, and then this incredibly low-key thing happened. And then it turned out one person missed their flight and he had all the charts. Or it was really cold in the observatory and I was wearing a little like flight suit that heated me up and I forgot it was plugged into the wall and ran across the room and I unplugged myself. Or just like all these goofy little things. But along those lines, that actually reminded me of a question I wanted to ask you, because I had done all of this research by interviewing colleagues and sort of had an idea of how the book would come together and saw it take shape based on what they'd said. And I love how your book is organized. And you described this earlier, that it's sorted around these events and concepts like how we celebrate birth or monthly rituals or coming of age. And as a reader, I felt like every single one that you hit was so amazingly accurate. I would go through it and go, oh God, we do celebrate that. And I recognize that. And I kept seeing familiarity over and over. And it's also really obvious that you did huge amounts of research on how these things are marked across so many different cultures. I think both of our books do this sort of example vignette style of storytelling. And I know how much exhaustive research goes into getting, there's one paragraph with 4 nice examples, and I know there's piles of cutting room floor material. So I'm curious, did you start with the outline thinking, here are the universal markers of life on our planet, and then go out to research them? Or did you start with this big open-ended question of like, how are people humans here on Earth, and then find the familiarities between them? Because it seems like a big question, but yeah.
Well, oh, my light just said, how are people, can you still see me? My light went off. How are people humans here on Earth is always my question for, but no, I feel like for when, thank you, first of all. I think that what really started me on this path to write this book was this idea, not to just jump in the deep end, but death is kind of the thing that you can't, for those of us who are secular or who, have some cultural, familial traditions that we like to hang on to, which I certainly do, but don't really connect with any theology, and who just believe that, evidence is the pathway to understanding. There are a lot of things in life that you can sort of do half-assed, you can have Christmas or not, you can sort of, people have secular weddings, people do all sorts of things in that sort of gray area. But there's something about death and grief and mourning that just, no matter what you believe or don't believe, it calls out for recognition. And it really, I think we have to acknowledge that we need something, not something that's mystical, not something that's an explanation, not something that tells us we'll be reunited again, or that, that there's a silver lining, but something that allows us to process this unbelievable change that happens. Here we are walking around, and somehow it goes away, whatever this is. And so writing about losing my dad when I was 14, was sort of and wondering, like, how do we do this without religion? How do we go through this process, this change, this mourning, was the first kernel of it. And then so as I started sort of researching that kind of thing, and researching, the ways in which the secular and religious ways in which we've done that over the eons, I'm like, kind of like, and you generally like to think of myself as an upbeat person. I was like, well, I don't want to write about like only death. And it occurred to me that there are all these celebrations, all these momentous, beautiful moments where the infrastructure for many people, for much of history, has been religious, but it doesn't have to be. And when you sort of peel back this first layer, there's a real, scientific phenomena at the root of it. And I sort of started thinking, what if we could celebrate, just the spring equinox and not necessarily layer any other mythology over it? And for me, I think that the solstices, equinoxes, and like birth and death, I was like, okay, I know that these are being recognized, throughout history and around the world. And so I think I started with those and started researching these examples and started finding, of course, as you're researching, or at least for me, it's like, oh, you have dozens of books available to you on like Greek and Roman history, and then you have to make a little bit more effort to find other ancient cultures that didn't get as much attention, or who were the records were destroyed. They didn't get to pass on those traditions to another generation because of the unfolding of the history of the world. And I think once I had those sort of tenets, and then I started to think, okay, well, what else is there that we all sort of lean on? And some cultures don't do all of them. Each culture does some, but not all. But it was amazing to me how, and it was uplifting and beautiful to me how connected and how similar we are in all these disparate places where we had no way of communicating with one another, but we all thought, boy, when somebody goes through puberty, we got to talk about it somehow and do a party or something.
Yeah, you had an entry, one of your chapters is on Independence Days. And I remember seeing that and feeling surprised because there were so many natural phenomena in there, birth or monthly things or weekly or even daily and sunrises. And then it really quickly got me thinking about, like my grandmother being born right as women were getting the right to vote, or even scientific research and how it sort of got, like, the way we understand the universe has been shaped by political upheavals. Einstein's theory of general relativity was tested the way it was in part of a very difficult relationship between a scientist a scientist affiliated with Germany and a scientist in Britain, Arthur Eddington. And the political challenge seems like you can sometimes look at it and say, oh, that's very human compared to the spinning of the earth and the rotation of our galaxy, but it shaped our understanding of the universe just as much. So it wound up making a lot of sense to have it in there. And I was sitting there going, oh, wow, how did she make such a perfect list? But,
Thank you. I mean, there's something like, the Independence Day, of course it's not a biological or astronomical event, but this idea of like, there is a system in place and someone says, wait a second, I'm not so sure this is the way we're going to do things or the best way to do things. And the ability for a whole generation to change their minds. I think there's something about that really does. There's a parallel with the way that we move forward in science.
It's a very familiar piece of human nature.
Yeah. And I think, and that independent thinking, that idea that, the way things are is not necessarily the way things have to be is very powerful. But one thing that I didn't cover in the book that I think about a lot, especially the last, week and a half, is how the changing of the year, New Year's, right? It's so arbitrary, right? We have this particular calendar based on a particular narrative, but all over the world, different cultures have different points in the year that are the new year, and just how astronomical that is. That idea that it's a circle, it's not a circle, but it's a rotation. We're making our way around the sun, and where we decide that starts and ends is totally arbitrary, but that we all feel this urge to connect with this beautiful journey that we're taking around our star.
Oh yeah. I remember when I was reading your book, I was thinking about how we sort of mark out a year. And it's funny because without even realizing it, the autumnal equinox always feels like my New Year's, because first of all, I've lived my whole life in a school calendar. Yes. So the fall and getting, new pencils and notebooks and getting to start a new year, it's still just as fun as a professor as it is when you're a student. And this obviously comes from somebody who loved school, but that has always felt like real New Year's for me. And summer is sort of
someone who's culturally Jewish. I also feel
I
feel like that in the fall does feel like the New Year.
That's when New Year's
who loves notebooks and like folders, and totally agree.
But either way, it gets to that sort of cyclical nature of that's when you mark time, and that's when you look back and you go, oh, what happened in this past year? So it was very recognizable to see that familiarity in your book.
Yeah, and I think that's so much of that is, this idea of how far we've come, for better or for worse, but reflecting back on it. And I think that in your book, the way you touch on like the history of what we're, the history of astronomy. And one of the things that I've really did a lot of underlining was when, you're talking about, it's still a male dominated field, and your experiences with those sort of like those moments of that I think many women have experienced of subtle, like, was that sexist? I think that was sexist, but maybe I can come up with a different understanding of why he asked me this question about who's really in charge. That I mean, that scene is really powerful and very familiar, but also this idea that you talk about imagining, you know, when women were literally not allowed to make these observations and couldn't be in the dormitories, and like imagining like it in sepia tones and like people wearing like hoop skirts, and then realizing that like the women who experienced that like are still astronomers today.
Yeah.
And like there's something about that idea of like taking those moments to turn around and say like, well, how much time has passed and what changes have we really made is extremely important.
Yeah, it was fascinating to talk to those women. And some of them, like I was a research student with Anne Bosgaard, who was one of the first women to observe under her own name at one of the California observatories. And yeah, I think it's an interesting way that we sort of perceive and treat time, that the past always sounds further away than it is.
Yes.
And I'll have people ask me this sometimes. They say, oh, remember back when there was sexism in astronomy and we fixed it now. And it's dramatically different than it was when these women were, you know, fighting to even be allowed to use a telescope rather than sort of sneaking in the side. And by the way, I also found that fascinating, that there were rules saying women couldn't use telescopes and couldn't do research. And they absolutely used telescopes and did amazing research. They just had to clear these extra hurdles that men didn't. And nowadays, those aren't the challenges. But the example you gave in the book is, I remember thinking that I wish, and I think a lot of women probably think this, I wish there was a sign that would flash saying someone is being sexist right now. That's definitely what's happening. There's no ambiguity. And so often you're going, am I being oversensitive? Maybe they're just being a jerk. Maybe they're just tired of not thinking about what they're saying.
Yeah.
And it's a very different type of problem, but it's not a problem. And I think noting, you know, only 50 years ago, we were dealing with pretty substantial challenges in the field. 50 years sounds incredibly long, or it sounds like yesterday, depending on where you are in your life and what your perspective is. But it's interesting to look now and say, what 50 years from now is somebody going to look back and say, my God, remember in the old days when we did X. So talking to people from this broad time scale of my field was an interesting way to track how that evolution happened.
And I think circling back to what we were talking about in the very beginning, this idea that like, in order to like really move forward and really have deep understanding, we have to like ruthlessly scrutinize how things are and how they've changed and how they haven't changed. And I think there are so many elements of society where, you know, that is the way forward. That is how we're going to get to a place where our understanding, where we are more enlightened in all senses.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, I'm looking at the time. Oh, yep, there we go.
Hi, Bonnie.
Hi.
Impeccable timing. Thank you for watching the clock. I have hopped back on because it is time to answer some audience questions. So to our attendees, we do already have a few questions in the chat, so I'm excited to get to those. If anyone has any questions for our authors, be sure to submit it on the little Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and hopefully our authors will be able to answer those questions for you. So let's get started. So you both have this sort of simultaneous science background and then artistic background as well. There's sort of like these dual worlds that I think you each have a foot in. And so Dan Ryan is curious, like in our education system, we see this big movement toward a STEM model, which I think you both probably have familiarity with. But do you think that this will prove to be maybe less effective because we're not always encouraging students to have a foot in both worlds in the way that the two of you do? What do you think about that sort of dichotomy?
Yeah. So first of all, I love the acronym STEAM. So science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, right? And I agree. I think that weighting the arts and prioritizing the arts is invaluable. I mean, my book has a little bit of memoir in it, sort of talking about my path into astronomy. And what was missing from it for pure length is the huge amount of time I spent as a kid playing violin, acting in drama clubs, singing in chorus. And I didn't have any I didn't have any outlandish skill in any of these areas, but oh my gosh, it was so much fun. And how much I always loved writing. I think that we do a disservice to kids by pretending that these are separate things.
Yes.
I think that science is actually an unbelievably creative endeavor, that you're faced with a set of rules. And in our case, it's the laws of physics. And you say, well, I want to explain something, or I have a challenge that I want to meet. And within those rules, if you're as creative as possible without breaking the rules, you can create something new and interesting. And it's the same if you're, staging a play. You have to face the audience. The people have to be able to see and hear your actors. There are rules to follow, but within that, you can explore. So I think this idea that creativity and science should be taught separately is an unfortunate one. And I think that arts are a part of science and vice versa.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, one of the things, I think it's very difficult, I think, when you're a kid and you have like departmentalized class and you have one class with one teacher and they talk about one thing and the bell rings and you go somewhere else with someone else to talk about something else, to realize how interconnected all of this is. And I think, and how much more deeply we can understand any one area when we understand, like you were saying, like the political context of what was going on with Einstein, and and with art, with science, with music, with literature, with history. There's no way to deeply understand one without understanding how they're connected. And I think the emphasis on STEM is really important correction for a lot of what has not gone well maybe in the school system over the last few decades. But I think that the next step after that is finding the ways that they're interconnected, and finding the really, really deep insights come from the places where they overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very insightful. I do think that there's this false binary that's created, that that these two things are an or and not an and also B, that these two things are fundamentally unrelated, which of course is not true. Of course, they are both in conversation with each other. So yeah, what a lovely answer. Thank you both. We have another audience question. So Ale asks, she says, my favorite radio telescope was Arecibo, since I was inspired to become a space scientist by Dr. Arroway. And she's curious, Sasha, do you have a special memory from Arecibo or PR?
Oh, hi, Ali. I was really small the few times that we were there. I wasn't there during the filming of Contact at all. And I was definitely, I think, before the horizon of my firm memories the last time that we were there. But I definitely feel a fondness, and I'm so sad to know that it was so badly little storm, that it was so badly damaged. But I wish I had spent more time there in my later years, when I could really have formed a clearer memory of being there.
What about
I'll add to that.
Yeah.
So first of all, we share the same taste in books. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I have my disintegrating, I read it until it fell apart copy of Contact on my bookshelf. Somebody got me a prettier, shinier copy, but I still like the one where the first 4 chapters are falling out because I read it so much. I had never visited Arecibo. And when I was getting ready to research this book, I was planning out the trips that I could take. I was writing this book in my spare time while trying to get tenure at the University of Washington. And I knew I had to fit travel in around where I was already going for my research, or where I could sort of combine a few trips. And I almost went to Arecibo. And then I said, I've had so many people tell me great stories about the observatory. I know that's enough for the book. I should go soon. I'm sure it'll always be there. And then it underwent this catastrophic collapse in December of 2020. And I had colleagues, there's footage of the collapse, and they knew that it was happening and they were monitoring the telescope. Amazingly, nobody was hurt. But I had colleagues tell people, please stop sharing the footage. It's like we lost a colleague. And people had lived there, lived on site, had done their entire thesis, had done years of research at the observatory, and it was mourned in the community. So I'm so sorry I missed the chance to go there. The heartening thing is that people are hoping to maybe rebuild something there, or thinking about, I mean, at this point, Puerto Rico and Arecibo is such an amazing place for astronomy that there's questions, can we build the old telescope? Can we put something newer and better in its place? But it's such an iconic telescope in the field. So once there's something new there, I will go right away. I will not wait.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Amazing. So thank you both for sharing your knowledge and memories of Arecibo. We have another question from an attendee. Leah is curious if either of you have seen the new film Don't Look Up, and how did it sort of affect you? Did you think it was exaggerated, realistic? What did you think of the film?
I haven't seen it yet. My Oscar viewing ritual starts now, where all the movies that I think are going to get nominated we watch. But I have had about 30 text messages from friends saying, "Do you know that Leonardo DiCaprio mentions your dad?" So it's at the top of the list, but I haven't seen it yet.
I have seen part of it. I was told to watch the opening because, as it turns out, Don't Look Up and my book actually open at the exact same telescope. They open at the Subaru telescope on Mauna Kea, and they open with a grad student observing, and then something goes wrong. But I'd seen parts of it, and I think every colleague of mine except me at this point has watched it and live tweeted it, because the framework of it is astronomy, but the real topic of it is it's a metaphor for climate change, and it's talking about science denial. And my understanding of it is I actually find it kind of depressing. And I know that there's a particular type of humor that really pokes very harsh, realistic fun at the errors that we see happening in people around us. But I can't help but think a bit more hopefully about it. Like, I'd rather somebody make the movie where we get over the struggles that we're dealing with and tackles the challenge of how can we be better than this. But I have heard from climate scientist colleagues who have said it is painful how much they recognize in it. So the movie has absolutely hit a nerve for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I was reading a Twitter thread earlier today that was like, similarly, I was from a climate scientist who was similarly like, oh, this is too close to home, like, which is I guess incredible that they were able to capture that experience, but also a little disheartening.
I'm picturing like Dr. Strangelove as you're talking about this,
That's the comparison a lot of people have made. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we have another question from Ale. It says that I just auditioned, sorry, I lost it for a second there, but I just auditioned for TEDx talking about the UN Space for Women program. And one of the organizers asked why she chose the topic, and if it's an outdated topic since women are allowed to go to university now. Emily, what are your thoughts on that? How would you approach receiving a question like that as someone who's had to deal with this kind of attitude?
I mean, it's fabulous that women are allowed, is an interesting use of word, at universities. It's great. But I think it reflects a really common sentiment where we think of sexism, or we think of a lot of isms, as things that are purely in the past, because there were a lot of people who worked very hard and were very vocal to fix big glaring problems. And it's really tempting to go, oh, we're done now. And there's two aspects of it. And one is that we always want efforts around equity and inclusion to be truly equitable. In my book, I write about how the percent of women in astronomy has shifted. And in 2017, I think 40% of the PhDs in astronomy were awarded to women. And 40%, that's pretty excellent. At the same time, 4% of those were Hispanic women and 2% were Black women. So the representation in the field is much better than it used to be, but it's still nowhere near what you would imagine if we really gave equitable opportunities to people who love science. Because when I talk to 8-year-olds at a planetarium show who all want to ask me about black holes and all want to ask me about aliens, they're from absolutely every walk of life you can imagine. And we really want to make sure that there's even opportunities coming in. We also want to support people once they're there. So you could tell them that women are allowed at universities now. The fraction of university presidents that are women, or tenured professors, or women who are high profile and public scientists, that's a very different number. And there are people making strides and putting in a great deal of effort to change that. My university president is a woman. My last department chair here at University of Washington is a woman. The president of the American Astronomical Society is a woman. So we're starting to see women moving into leadership positions, but the ratio is very different. So it's one thing to allow people into a field, and it's another to really nourish and sort of support them in the field. Women will leave science at a larger rate than men. And it's important and complicated to look at why. So I think it's still a very relevant comment, because we may no longer be barred, but there's still challenges to be faced in order to say that we truly will have the same opportunities and the same experiences, regardless of gender, regardless of race in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is sort of a misconception when we're talking about systemic oppressions at large.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we got over the one big hurdle, and surely that was the only hurdle that we had to go over. And it's like, there's a little bit more nuance than that to these very complicated questions. But yeah, thank you so much for that insightful answer. So we do have a few more minutes. I actually have a question before we close out. And then I have some nice things from the audience that I also want to share with you both. But I was curious, because I think both of your books speak to a lot of these sort of patterns and these parallel, I guess, occurrences. Like we see these repetitions, like, of course, Sasha, with like the rituals that you see across cultures. And then Emily, of course, I think like these going back through history and seeing things change, but also how that curiosity, that wonder stays the same. And so I was just kind of curious if you had any particular sort of like pattern like that, or a particular thread that as you were writing the book became evident that maybe you hadn't thought about before, or each of your books. Yeah.
Oh, I'll try and answer first. So I think something that surprised me about my book is that I am trained as a scientist. I got to enjoy the experience, and now am hoping to do more, of being a writer and an author. And I hadn't necessarily intended to write a book about the people of astronomy. And it was a surprise to me as I put the book together. I knew that I wanted to use the anecdotes and tales of sort of behind the scenes in astronomy to teach people about astronomy and teach people about science. And it really impressed upon me something that I'd sort of subconsciously known or taken for granted, which is how much the humans are ingredients in scientific research. I will borrow a quote from Sasha, from your dad. One of the oft quoted lines is, to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. And we tend to think of it as, oh, you need the atoms that make the apples and the flour and the sugar. But it's also about the atoms that make the baker, or that make the planet that he can live on, and with enough like leisure time to say, you know, it would be really delicious. And I feel like the humans and the human curiosity that wound up being a really common thread throughout my book are as much a part of the science process as the telescopes and the stellar physics and the math concepts that we need. And we can think of science as really remote and inaccessible and as sort of robotic. And I think people seeing the humanity in scientific research and how important our curiosity is really important when it comes to understanding and trusting science, and into getting why we should support it. So that was a thread in my book that surprised me, that I was very happy to see come out of it.
It's really good. Yeah. Yeah. I think the thread that I found is that, like, you know, throughout history, there have been times and places, or families even, where there is immense pressure to follow to the letter these traditions and rituals. And no matter how tightly we try to force, those and control the way the next generation does something or believes something, which of course you cannot, there is no way to control. It's rituals and traditions and these rites of passage and these ideas, they have to mutate in order to survive. And the more room and air that we give them, the more likely that there is some little kernel that will live on a few more millennia. And the times when we make it so impossible to let them change with time, change with our understanding of the world, are the times when they do not survive and they don't make it to the next generation. And I think that the things that are, really meaningful and really powerful to us still now, that feel really ancient, some of them are still very, very new on the scale of human history. I mean, everything, the most traditional things you can think of are new on the scale of human history. And, if you think, oh, well, I don't want to be the first person in 6,000 years not to do X, Y, and Z, there's that weight. But then when you zoom out a little further, 6,000 years is nothing. And the things that really are traditional are, the ways that we make a feast together and raise young together and form a tribe together and look up at the night sky, and try to get a glimpse of an idea of where we are and what's going on up there. And I think that, everything else is just, it works if it works. Otherwise, we can let it fall away and let something new take its place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What a wonderful way to close out the conversation. Before we say goodbye, I do want to share a few wonderful comments that folks have made in the chat and in the Q&A box just about these amazing books. So first we have Stephen, who's talking about your book, Emily. He said that his teenage wish was to be an astronomer, even though his dad wanted him to be a pharmacist. And he says that your book, Emily, speaks to him as sort of the road not taken. He's an advanced amateur astronomer nowadays and enjoys following your path as you live out something that he's always loved. So he just says, thank you for sharing your entertaining tales and your utter enthusiasm. He was glued to your book, and he's recommended it to so many folks. And then Sasha, we had a few people in the chat talking about how much they loved For Small Creatures Such as We, and how they actually adopted some of the rituals that you talk about in the book. So it's just really incredible to see all these really lovely comments in the chat. And I know that when you're in conversation, you don't always get to read them. So I wanted to make sure that you saw the lovely things that folks have been saying. But yeah, that brings us to the end of a truly stunning conversation. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Emily, for your generous conversation and sharing such interesting stories about your books and your lives. And thank you to our incredible audience who was so enthusiastic and full of love in the chat. You really love to see it. That's what author events are all about. If anyone is interested in picking up a copy of the book, you can order of either book. You can order copies at the link that I am attempting to copy and paste into the chat here. That link will be live until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. So folks who are interested in getting a copy or getting a copy for your friend because you realize that they need to read these books, you can order both For Small Creatures Such as We and The Last Stargazers through the link I just dropped in the chat. So again, thank you to our audience. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Emily. This has been such a wonderful, wonderful evening. So good night, everyone.
A pleasure. Thank you so much,
Thank
Bonnie.
you.
Emily, I hope